We were sitting on the couch watching a movie when he leaned in a little closer. Our knees touched, just a casual accident, but the moment lingered. I looked up at him. He was staring at me with those dark eyes, his lips slightly parted as if he was waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. "You okay?" Chris asked softly, his voice carrying a hint of concern. But it wasn't concern for my well-being. It was concern for something else entirely. Before I knew it, I was kissing him. At first, it was hesitant, a mere whisper of a touch, testing the waters to see if it was real. But when he kissed me back, something inside me shifted, something dark and thrilling. I'd never kissed anyone the way I kissed him. Next, I was on him. I felt him and realized he was all ready. Best feeling ever. Let me pause for a moment. If you love stories like this, do well to subscribe and turn on the notification for more. Now let's go back to how it all began. Life was supposed to be simple, wasn't it? A happy marriage, a steady job, a peaceful home. At 29, I had what many women would dream of. A loving husband, Benjamin, a steady income, and a sense of stability that I thought would last forever. Yet, as I sit here now, about to share the story I never imagined I would live, I can't help but wonder how everything changed so quickly and how much I ignored along the way. Benjamin and I met when I was just 24. He was everything I thought I wanted in a man. Tall, dark, handsome, and with an air of confidence that made me feel secure. He had a career in finance, and I worked as a marketing manager in a small but thriving firm. We clicked instantly, and what started as a whirlwind romance soon became a steady, comfortable relationship. We married 2 years later, and I thought that was it, the beginning of my forever. I thought I knew everything there was to know about love, but when I look back now, I see I was so wrong. Benjamin's family was kind, but there was something about his brother, Chris, that stood out to me from the very beginning. Chris, just a few years younger than Benjamin, was different. He wasn't as polished as Benjamin. He didn't have the same level of refinement. He was more laid back, more free-spirited. While Benjamin would dress in tailored suits and talk about stocks and bonds at family gatherings, Chris would show up in jeans and a t-shirt, making everyone laugh with his sarcastic humour. At first, I never thought much about it. Chris was just Benjamin's brother, after all. He would come over for dinner now and then, and I always enjoyed his company. He had a way of making things feel lighter, funnier. I liked having him around, but there was something about the way he looked at me that began to make me uneasy. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. A lingering glance, a subtle compliment about my dress or my hair, little things I brushed off as harmless. It wasn't until a couple of years into our marriage that I started to notice more. The little touches on my arm as he passed by me, the way he would stand just a little too close. And then, one evening, it happened. We were alone in the kitchen preparing dinner together while Benjamin was at the office, working late as usual. Chris was laughing at something I said, and suddenly he was too close. His hand brushed mine, and I felt it. That jolt of electricity. It was nothing more than a brush, but it sent a shock straight through my chest. I pulled my hand away quickly, my heart racing in a way I had never experienced before. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you," Chris said with a chuckle, clearly oblivious to the effect his touch had on me. Or maybe he wasn't. I couldn't tell. The moment passed, but something had shifted. I felt guilty for even feeling that electric spark. After all, I was married to Benjamin, and here I was, feeling something for his brother. It was wrong, wasn't it? Of course it was. But the feeling lingered. It gnawed at me. I tried to push it away, telling myself that I was imagining things. Nothing would ever happen. I was happy with Benjamin, right? But then, over time, the little moments kept adding up. Chris's jokes became more flirtatious, and my responses, though hesitant, were always met with a smile. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. He understood me in ways Benjamin didn't. He saw me for more than just the woman in a perfect marriage. I felt seen. I felt heard. The distance between Benjamin and me grew subtly, imperceptibly, as I found myself talking to Chris more. It started innocently enough. Just conversations over coffee, just casual chats about life. But the more I spoke to him, the more I realized how much I was enjoying it. The attention, the flattery, the connection. It felt so different from what I had with Benjamin. But I couldn't. I couldn't let this happen. Benjamin was my husband, my partner. But with each passing day, it became harder to deny the feelings I was harboring. They weren't just passing thoughts. They were becoming real, tangible feelings that I couldn't suppress anymore. I should have stopped it. I should have told Chris to back off. But I didn't. And that, my friends, is where the trouble began. Before I go on with the rest of the story, I have to ask you, if you're enjoying this tale of secrets and betrayal, don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. It's funny how the line between right and wrong can blur so easily. You don't even notice it happening at first. It's like walking along a path and not realizing you've strayed off the beaten trail until you look up and realize you're miles from where you started. And by then, it's too late to turn back. After that moment in the kitchen when Chris's touch sent a jolt through me, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I told myself it was just a moment, that I was imagining things, I was overreacting. But it wasn't long before I realized that I wasn't, and neither was he. Chris started coming over more often, and Benjamin was busy with work more than ever. His job as a corporate finance consultant kept him away from home, sometimes for days at a time. I wasn't lonely, Benjamin made sure of that, showering me with material things, planning weekends away, keeping up appearances. But there was a part of me that felt disconnected. We no longer had those late-night conversations about our dreams or our fears. Benjamin had become so focused on his career, I often felt like I was living with a stranger. Chris, on the other hand, was always around. He'd pop in for a beer after work, linger for dinner when he didn't feel like cooking for himself, and I never once turned him away. Our conversations shifted from small talk to something deeper. He'd ask about my day, my thoughts, what was on my mind. It was an emotional connection, and one I couldn't ignore. He knew how to listen in a way Benjamin hadn't in months. The first time it happened, I felt as though the ground beneath me had vanished. It wasn't something we planned. It wasn't something either of us thought would ever happen. But one evening, after a few drinks and a few laughs, we were sitting in the living room, alone. Benjamin was out of town on a business trip, and I had made dinner just for the two of us. Chris had been at my house almost every night that week. The more time we spent together, the more the boundary between sibling-in-law and something more began to fade. We were sitting on the couch watching a movie when he leaned in a little closer. Our knees touched, just a casual accident, but the moment lingered. I looked up at him. He was staring at me with those dark eyes, his lips slightly parted as if he was waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. "You okay?" Chris asked softly, his voice carrying a hint of concern. But it wasn't concern for my well-being. It was concern for something else entirely. Before I knew it, I was kissing him. At first, it was hesitant, a mere whisper of a touch, testing the waters to see if it was real. But when he kissed me back, something inside me shifted, something dark and thrilling. I'd never kissed anyone the way I kissed him. The passion was immediate, overwhelming, and as our lips met again, I felt a rush of heat, of desire, a hunger that I hadn't even realized I'd been suppressing. It lasted only a few seconds, but to me, it felt like an eternity. When we broke apart, both of us were breathless. I sat back, feeling a wave of shame wash over me. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It was like I was looking at a stranger who had the face of my brother-in-law. Chris was looking at me too, his chest rising and falling with each breath. There was a slight grin on his face, But his eyes told a different story. He was just as conflicted as I was, but there was no denying the chemistry between us. The tension was thick in the air, the unspoken words hanging like a fragile thread between us. I didn't mean to, I began, my voice trembling, but Chris stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. Don't apologize, he said quietly, his tone serious. We both knew what we were doing. And maybe, just maybe, we've both been feeling the same thing for a long time. I pulled away from him, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for any reason to stop this madness. But there was no turning back. That was the moment I knew I was already in too deep. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And somehow, in that brief moment of weakness, I had justified it. I told myself it was only a kiss. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't as if I was planning on falling in love with him, right? It was just a mistake, something that happened in the heat of the moment. But it wasn't a mistake. It was real. And it scared me. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The dynamic between us shifted in ways I couldn't explain. We started spending even more time together, and every moment felt charged with an unspoken understanding. The occasional touch on my arm, the lingering looks, the way he would smile at me like we were sharing some secret that no one else knew. I tried to fight it, tried to remind myself that I was married to Benjamin, that Chris was his brother, that what I was doing was wrong. But the more I resisted, the more I was drawn to him. I couldn't talk to Benjamin about this. How could I? How could I confess to the man I loved that I had crossed a line with his brother, that I was keeping a secret so dark, so shameful, that I couldn't even say it out loud? No, I couldn't tell him. So I kept lying. I kept telling myself it would stop. I kept telling myself that I would put an end to it. But I didn't. One night, Chris and I were alone again. Benjamin was on another business trip. I had prepared a simple dinner, and we ate together in the silence that had become our new normal. But it was different this time. The air was thick with tension, and when Chris reached across the table to touch my hand, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I felt as though I was losing control of my own body, of my own desires. Before I knew it, we were in my bedroom. We didn't say a word. We didn't need to. He kissed me again, but this time it was deeper, hungrier, as if neither of us could stop. My mind screamed for me to stop, to push him away, but my body betrayed me. I had already crossed that line, and now I couldn't take it back. It was wrong. I knew it. I hated myself for it, but in that moment, I didn't care. The next morning, after the storm of emotions had passed, I woke up next to Chris. I couldn't even look at him. I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, so powerful that it almost knocked me off the bed. My heart was pounding, my thoughts jumbled. I had just slept with my husband's brother. I had just destroyed everything. I couldn't undo what had happened, and that terrified me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I wasn't just lying to Benjamin. I was lying to myself. I didn't know how to stop this. I didn't know how to make it right. And now the consequences were starting to show. You never think that things will get out of control. You tell yourself that everything will be fine, that you can handle it, that you're in control. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes you're not in control at all. Sometimes life takes the reins, and you're left trying to catch up, trying to put the pieces back together when you realize how broken everything is. The morning after I slept with Chris, I couldn't even look at him. It was as though the whole world had turned upside down. I should have been horrified, disgusted even, but instead I felt lost. My emotions were a tangled mess of guilt, shame, and something I refused to acknowledge: desire. I knew I had crossed the ultimate line, and I could never take it back. But what was worse, I felt completely powerless to stop whatever had begun. I spent the next few days in a daze. Benjamin came back from his business trip, and we went back to the motions of our daily lives. He had no idea what had happened, no idea that his brother and I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I tried to act normal, to pretend like everything was okay, but I felt like I was walking around in a fog. Every time I looked at Benjamin, all I could think about was Chris. I kept telling myself that it was just a mistake, just a one-time thing. But I couldn't ignore the truth. This wasn't a one-time thing. Something had shifted between Chris and me, something that neither of us had the power to undo. The next few weeks were a blur. I avoided Chris as much as possible, telling myself that I needed to stop before it went any further. I thought about telling Benjamin the truth, but every time the thought crossed my mind, I choked on the words. How could I confess this? How could I admit to my husband that I had been unfaithful to him, not just with another man, but with his own brother? It was the ultimate betrayal, something I couldn't even begin to face. But then came the moment that would change everything. It started with a late-night feeling of nausea. I woke up in the middle of the night, clutching my stomach, and rushed to the bathroom. The moment I saw the blood, I knew something was wrong. I thought I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I feared the worst. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. I made an appointment with my doctor the next morning. When I sat in that sterile room waiting for the results, I was terrified. I had no idea what I was about to hear. I tried to convince myself that it was all a coincidence, that everything would be fine. But it wasn't fine. "Janeth, I'm afraid you're pregnant," the doctor said, her voice soft but firm. The words hit me like a freight train. Pregnant. But how? Who was the father? I stared at her in shock, unable to process what she was saying. I wasn't ready for this. I couldn't be pregnant. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "Do you know who the father might be?" the doctor asked, her eyes searching mine. I froze. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't tell her the truth. How could I? How could I explain to anyone that I had no idea who the father was? My husband Benjamin or his brother Chris? How could I live with that kind of uncertainty, knowing that I had crossed a line with both men, knowing that my actions could destroy everything? I left the doctor's office in a daze, my mind racing. I didn't want to be pregnant. Not like this. Not with this mess hanging over my head. But there was no going back. This was my reality now. When I got home, I couldn't even look Benjamin in the eye. He was talking to me, asking about my day, but all I could think about was the baby growing inside me. Was it his? Or was it Chris's? I felt like I was suffocating. There was no escape from this nightmare I had created. A few days later, I ran into Chris again. We had barely spoken since that night, but somehow he found me alone at the grocery store. I couldn't avoid him any longer. My heart pounded in my chest as he approached me, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. "Janeth," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "We need to talk." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. "I know," I whispered back. "I've been avoiding you. I don't know what to say." He looked at me for a moment, as if trying to read me before taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking about us," he said, "about everything that happened. And I need to know, are you okay?" I laughed bitterly. "Am I okay?" I repeated, shaking my head. "No, Chris, I'm not okay. I'm pregnant and I don't know who the father is. It could be you or it could be Benjamin. I'm not sure and I'm terrified." He was silent for a moment and I could see the weight of the situation sinking in for him. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch sending a shiver through me. "I don't know what to do either," he said softly. "But we can't keep pretending like this isn't happening." The truth of it hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't keep living in this lie. I had to tell Benjamin. I had to face the consequences of my actions, no matter how painful it was. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. The fear of losing everything was too great. I spent the next few days in turmoil, torn between my guilt for betraying Benjamin and my feelings for Chris. I knew I needed to tell Benjamin the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. But time was running out. I couldn't hide this forever. The truth was going to come out, whether I was ready or not. And when it did, everything would change. The day I finally decided to tell Benjamin the truth was the hardest of my life. I had spent days, weeks really, trying to figure out how to face him, how to tell him the truth about what I had done, about the affair with Chris and the baby that I wasn't sure belonged to either of them. The guilt weighed on me like 1,000 pounds, but the fear of the consequences was even worse. I didn't know how he would react, but I knew I couldn't keep lying to him. Benjamin was sitting on the couch when I walked into the living room, looking as calm as ever, his laptop open in front of him as he worked. The same man I married, focused, quiet, seemingly unaffected by everything that was happening. I envied his ability to compartmentalize, to bury the truth beneath the surface and go on with life. But I couldn't. Not anymore. The secret had consumed me, eaten away at me every single day. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel my hands trembling, and I forced myself to take deep breaths to calm my nerves. But there was no escaping what was about to happen. "Benjamin," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, pausing for a moment before closing his laptop. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. I couldn't answer him immediately. I just stared at him. At the man I had loved for years, at the man I had betrayed in the worst way possible. His calm demeanor made it all the more difficult. It was as if he had no idea what was coming, and part of me wished I could shield him from the truth forever. But I couldn't. "I need to tell you something," I said finally, my voice cracking. "Something I've been hiding from you." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as if sensing that something was wrong. "What is it, Janeth?" His voice was soft but urgent now, and I could feel his concern growing. I took a deep breath. "I've been seeing someone else. It's been going on for months, and it was a mistake. I'm sorry. I should have never let it happen, but I did." Benjamin's face didn't change immediately, but I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. He looked at me like he didn't understand what I was saying, like he couldn't quite process the words coming out of my mouth. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Who? Who is it?" My heart pounded harder in my chest. This was the moment I had feared, the moment I had been running from for so long. "It's Chris," I whispered, the words choking in my throat. "I slept with Chris." There was a long silence. Benjamin's expression remained unreadable, but I could see his eyes harden as he processed what I had just confessed. "You slept with my brother?" he finally asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. I nodded, my eyes filling with tears. "I'm so sorry, Benjamin. I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know what came over me, I wasn't thinking, I was selfish." He stood up abruptly, walking away from me, pacing back and forth in the living room. I watched him, feeling like I was watching my world crumble in slow motion. He ran a hand through his hair, his body tense with anger. "I can't believe this," he muttered to himself, more to himself than to me. "My own brother. And you. How could you?" I stood up, desperate to reach him, to make him understand. I know I've ruined everything. I don't know what to say to make it right, but please just let me explain. Let me tell you everything." He turned to face me, his eyes cold. "Explain what, Janeth? How could you betray me like this? How could you betray us both?" I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say? That I was confused? That I was lost? That I hadn't meant to hurt him? None of that would matter now. I had made my choices, and now I had to face the consequences. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "I can't take it back, Benjamin. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to fix it." He stood there for a moment, staring at me, his eyes full of hurt, and then he turned away. "I need some time," he said quietly. I can't deal with this right now." And with that, he left. The next few days were a blur of silence and awkward tension. Benjamin didn't come home that night. I didn't hear from him for hours, and every time I tried to call, he didn't answer. I knew he needed space, but that didn't stop the gnawing feeling of dread that sat in the pit of my stomach. The truth had come out, but that was only the beginning of what would follow. The real question was, what now? Could our marriage survive this? Could Benjamin forgive me? The days dragged on, and every time I heard the sound of the door opening, my heart would race in anticipation. But it was never Benjamin. It was always Chris. Chris, my brother-in-law. The man I had betrayed not once but twice. The man I had hurt in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And now, I had to face him. Chris came over a few days after the confession, and as soon as I saw him standing in the doorway, my heart dropped. He looked as lost as I felt, but there was something else there too, a quiet understanding that things between us could never go back to how they were. "Janeth," he said, his voice quiet, "how are you holding up?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "I feel like everything's falling apart. Benjamin, he doesn't want to talk to me. He doesn't even want to see me. I don't know what to do anymore." Chris stepped inside, his eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I never meant for any of this to happen, but now we have to figure out what to do next." I shook my head. "I don't know what's next. I don't know what to do. I've destroyed everything." But Chris wasn't finished. He took a deep breath, his expression serious. "There's one more thing, Janeth," he said. "You need to get a paternity test. You need to know who the father is. And you need to tell Benjamin the truth about everything." And just like that, I knew there was no more running. There was no more hiding from the truth. The baby was coming, and the question of who the father was would have to be answered. And no matter what the test said, the consequences would follow. Everything was out in the open now. The secret was no longer mine to carry. And as the days unfolded, I knew that the hardest part was just beginning.